Hello, friends of time, where we go over some of the stuff that's happening in the world. And welcome to the regulars, Michael Keller, High Flyer, Bill Barry in the GatesiGate or BillyGate, or however you want to call this. This is really just another fraud, another scam on the road to a one world government, which has been the goal of the lefties for 100 years. Beginning before the United Nations with the League of Nations after World War I. So today we're going to talk about the latest story, and I'm also going to get into, or the developments in this fraud, this scam of the coronavirus. And we're also going to get into a very detailed report that came out that Janice Fiamengo brought to my attention just this week. Extremely detailed report by, I believe, an economist who's looking at the actual data. And lo and behold, the actual published data proves out what we've been saying since the very, very beginning of this so-called pandemic. It also highlights the criminal activities of those in power. So we're going to get into some of that in detail. The report itself is very, very long and detailed, filled with charts and graphs and data. I picked out some of the highlights of it, and even just this bare highlights makes for a bit of a long go, but I'm going to try and keep it as quick as possible. And before we get straight into it, I'm going to highlight another report that just came out to me recently. It was a name attached to this, but this has some research results talking about your immune system's response, or I guess prevalence of immunoagents prior to the coronavirus and after the coronavirus, and it's indicating that, in fact, there's a significant amount of protection after being exposed to the coronavirus. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, have a look at it. I didn't read it in detail. It's pretty technical, quite technical. So I think to get the most out of it, you would be best to have a little bit of knowledge in immunology. Okay, so jumping straight into some of the materials here as a little backdrop and reminder to where we're at today. This is a screen cap that I've shown before. $3.7 trillion lost by the workers of the world, and $3.9 trillion gained by the already rich of the world. Whenever you've heard the expression 1,000 times, this is the biggest one-year wealth transfer in the history of humanity, by the way, and you've heard this a million times, and detectives and police organizations chasing criminals around the world, they have a very reliable, almost every single time you're researching a crime, what do? Follow the money. There's the big picture story of the money. Money robbed from regular people through their taxations, through the destruction of their businesses, blah, 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 all the rest of the stuff that you know has been going on over this pandemic. Planned, not by the coronavirus, but by the decisions made by the elite in power in response to the coronavirus. These are inflicted pain by the elite. And what did they gain out of it? $3.9 trillion new dollars in their bank accounts. That's what they gained out of it. So there you go. That is one big smoking gun. Evidence. Follow the money. Here, 9 executives from Moderna and all these companies here have been turned into brand new billionaires as a result of vaccines and other incidental profits due to this, quote, pandemic. And these billionaires are merely the sergeants, nearly the foot soldiers of the elite. They are profiting handsomely, and the elite are profiting way more, especially in how their tentacles of power have deepened and spread around the world by their own plan. Let's read on. And this brainwashing, this fear-mongering, this manufactured hysteria was very successful. Here we have somebody who calls herself Scary Mommy. I'm sure she's very scary if you're 1.5 or 2 years old. But Scary Mommy says vaccinated jewelry is a thing because we want people to know we're not a-holes. Well, I think we know who the a-holes are now, Scary Mommy. Let's have a look forward here. And I'm going to remind you of this. I've read this one out a few times. It bears repeating here. No case was ever made or required for lockdowns. They are illegal. They're illegal according to the Constitution of Canada. Every one, I suspect, I don't know all the laws of countries around the world, but certainly for Canada. And we're going to go into details on this, on how this is the crime of the millennia. This is the biggest crime in the history of humanity. It's a crime against humanity. Those in power knew what they're doing. They know what they're doing. Even though they took orders from the global elite to do it, that's why they were successful around the globe, in every left-leaning government around the world. They all acted in lockstep. They were implemented solely in response to lobbying by the elite, which included the provision that they remain in place until the whole world is vaccinated. The elite got rich, the poor got sick. That's what happened. That was the plan. This did not happen by accident. 9 new billionaires don't just pop into the world by accident. The super rich of the world don't just get an extra $3.7 trillion by accident. Let's read on. Here, so successful is their brainwashing of the sheep of the world, which is the majority of the world, I'm afraid. They've soaked up this fear being thrown at them. And in a way, I can't blame them because the majority of the world have never taken any science training. So how does someone without any science training dismiss some of the claims people are making in the name of science? For the majority of people, they don't have the training necessary to see through the crap that's being thrown at them day in and day night and day throughout this last year and a quarter. And now we have people popping tattoos, virtue signaling with tattoos on them about getting vaccinated. Here's several different ones. I've showed these before, but this is just warming up to today's show. Why I won't be easing up on my family's COVID-19 precautions, even though I'm fully vaccinated. We're going to see in excruciating detail just how stupid this Scary Mommy's response is. And Scary Mommy's response is not unusual. Scary Mommy has been duped at best, is stupid at worst, but has been duped, likely. Duped like the overwhelming majority of the world. And again, I sometimes am harsher than I should be on the people who have been duped, because the duped population, for the most part, has no science training. They merely rest all of their faith, and it is faith, on those in power. And those in power are corrupt. They are corrupt to the core. This is the most corrupt group of leaders ever seen circling the globe. And it's all about bringing in a one world government. We'll see. I'll tie that loose end back towards the end here. Here we have this kind of nonsense popping up already. Vaccinated seating. Proof of vaccination required. And to tell you, we talked about this with Janice, and Janice has frequently spoken on this Janice Fiamengo, that is, for those of you who are new here to the show, about this, is that this is heading towards violence. Those who are angry at anyone who resists getting vaccinated or following the rules, these people are being accused of killing grandma, etc., of putting everybody else at risk, even though this is fake hysteria that's been blown up by the elite for ulterior motives. And I've seen it at the beach here in the Dominican Republic. People who are little caseta owners, these are little beachside bars and restaurants. There was literally a fight, a physical fight, using the excuse, I don't know if they really were by this or just jealous of the business, but one beat up the other, by the accusation that they weren't following the government lockdown rules closely enough. Some people weren't wearing masks in their businesses. They had all the nerve of one of the businesses, they had hosted a birthday party where people on the beach, in a bar, where people weren't wearing masks. Physical fights have already started around the nonsense created by to enrich the rich, created by the elite. We, the people, have to stop this crap. We have to stop going to violence, being pushed towards violence by these greedy, evil elites that have taken control of our planet, the whole planet. Let's read on here. Tracking, this is in the New York Times, tracking coronavirus vaccinations around the world. Look at this, folks. In spite of it, I'm going to show you the evidence from that detailed article that these vaccines are not necessary. And I talked about this before last summer, saying that it takes a few weeks, up to 8 weeks, to for a virus to run its course through a community, and that community can be as big as the whole globe. Once the herd, the sufficient percentage of the herd has been exposed to the virus has nowhere else to grow. It dies, it leaves, it becomes extinct. We could have been there last summer, before the end of summer. We didn't have to suffer through more waves of this. This was created, concocted in the imaginations of the elites, specifically, folks, for this reason right here. Selling vaccines. Selling vaccines. Look at the number and the growth of the number of vaccines administered. 2.05 billion vaccine doses have been administered worldwide. Administered. Much more than that have been sold and not yet administered. The contracts are signed and sealed. The products are still being produced and shipped. There will be in the order of 10 billion vaccines produced and sold. Maybe not all of them administered. Most of them probably. And that's just a start. They're going to be whipping up the hysteria for the next round of this. And it says here this is equivalent to 27 doses per every 100 people on the planet Earth. And they're pushing it right down into newborn babies. And we're going to see just how stupid, how not just negligent that is, it is criminal. There's no two ands, ways, or about it. This is criminal. This is the biggest crime in the history of humanity. Reading onwards here. Oops, this is locked up on me again. I don't know why. See if I can get it to. Whoops. Why does this do this so regularly? Okay, in any case, I'm going to push forward to the next session here. 2 billion vaccines sold already. And remember, these vaccines are experimental. They're not approved. And yet people are lining up to take them because a year was spent terrifying the world that this was some kind of horrid disease. We're going to see just how false that is. Read this from the top with me. And this is just a stuff carved out. This is Fauci here. Fauci's emails reveal what he really thought about masks. Masks are for infected people. Typical masks you buy is really not effective at keeping out the virus. I do not recommend you wear a mask. This is in February of 2020. They were just ironing out the narrative between them when the beginning of this thing. They weren't entirely on board in sync on every detail. Fauci had to toe the line and start saying everybody has to wear a mask. But a lot more incriminating emails are coming to the surface from Fauci, so and that's not going to be totally the focus of this today. Fauci, as big a player as he is, as big a fraud as he is, as big a criminal as he is, he's just a captain in this army. He's doing what he's told. For money, of course. Follow the money. Now, here's the article in question here. May 28th, 2021. This came to my attention, it was yesterday, I believe, from Janice Fiamengo, forwarded me this article. So, the lies exposed by the numbers, fear, misdirection, and institutional deaths, an investigative report. Okay, I'm going to just pause here for a second and look at a couple of comments. Sean is saying, we slowed the immunity like the bubble boy, we made things worse. That's right. The question should always have been why our billion-dollar healthcare system could not handle a few thousand infected. We're going to look at exactly that topic. And this article here, I do recommend you read it, but you better put aside a good length of time to read this one because it is long, it is detailed, it has lots of data in it. And 4,000 died in the US, 10,000 deaths in Europe from the jab. Yes, and that's just the surface of it. That's just the surface because many people are getting adverse reactions to these vaccines and they're not reporting them. And they're even reporting that they're even not even reporting all the deaths, doing quite the opposite of what they did with the coronavirus and recording everything as a coronavirus death. So let me pop one more out and then I'm going to get to the material here. 75 deadly weight 8 says 75% of all Canadian COVID deaths are responsible from the government-run facilities. Very stark data and tells another story beside the MSN narrative. Yes, exactly that. And I don't know if you've read this report, Deadly 8, but this we're getting into right now. The details of this, the proof of this. It's in the government's own public data. So let's read on what this fellow has to say. Reading from the top. April 30th, 2021, Canada published a weekly COVID-19 epidemiology report that included a simple breakdown of cases and deaths linked to outbreaks organized according to the location of the source of infection. Beneath the unassuming, superficial appearance of this data set lies the incriminating key to exposing and prosecuting a jaw-dropping series of scandals. Now, some people believe that criminal charges will be brought against this. I don't. I think this power scandal goes so far to the top, there's so much money involved, that every effort will be made to prevent any charge from ever being laid in this. There may be some small level fall guys falling out, but you're never going to get the prosecution or the crime or the details about what really went on at the top. Reading this is Dr. Bonnie Henry. Dr. Bonnie Henry is a big deal in British Columbia, Canada, but she's not a player in the world. She's just a foot soldier in this whole thing. Dr. Bonnie Henry, BC's provincial health officer, took the opportunity to tell the public that the infant's tragic death, this is the first infant to die, supposedly of coronavirus. Let's have a look. Reminds us of the vicious nature of this virus. The fear sparked by the headline and by Dr. Bonnie Henry's statement is palpable, yet buried in the text of the article is the missing context. Dr. Henry was using the magician's tool of misdirection to hide what was in plain sight. Let's read on. The very same article goes on to say that this was the very first death under the age of 30 in the entire province of British Columbia. Population 5 million. The first death of anyone under 30. More than a year and 2 waves into the pandemic. That in itself highlights just how not dangerous this virus is to young people under 30. But there's much more to this. This infant caught its infection inside the BC Children's Hospital. This paragraph is very important. It was already a patient, this child, before catching the virus inside the hospital. A hospital-transmitted infection, not an infection caught at school or out in the community. It was an infection caught behind the doors of a government institution. This matters because it reveals that the infant was not an average healthy child living as part of the regular community, but rather that it had extremely serious pre-existing health conditions, so severe that it required seeking out specialized care. And only serious conditions are admitted to the BC Children's Hospital. And that, the government care facility, is where the child caught the coronavirus. And that child, very sick, getting sicker inside the hospital from the lack of attention perhaps of the hospital people, is the only person dead in British Columbia out of 5 million people in a year and a half almost, or a year and a quarter of this so-called heavy-duty pandemic, including the waves. Let's read on. Yet the article neglects to mention what the pre-existing conditions the infant had, and Dr. Henry goes out of her way to emphasize that it was the virus and not the pre-existing conditions that led to its death. That Dr. Henry is deliberately obfuscating the truth in order to drive up the hysteria, pretending that your children, healthy children, if they go to school, they will be at risk, or if they play outside, that they will be at risk, therefore justifying the lockdowns which can only be lifted, you guessed it, if everyone buys into the vaccine scam. Sell vaccines. You get the picture, folks. They killed that child in order to make billions and trillions of dollars on vaccines and other incidental profits due to directly to whipping up the hysteria, manipulating the people, and getting the sheep to demand protection. Give me a vaccine, please, is the chorus they want all around the world, and they got it. Let's read on. This deflects from being able to understand the role that these pre-existing conditions played in increasing the infant's vulnerability to COVID virus. Then she immediately misdirects attention elsewhere by following up with a generic statement about risks from the virus, the vicious nature of the virus. This is not a vicious virus. These people, we are being led by the most corrupt group of leaders I can ever imagine, deliberately, at every turn, lying to us, lying to our faces, the vicious nature of the virus, which makes everyone recoil in fear and imagine the risks to themselves and their own children. And what do they direct you to? They use this fear to justify lockdowns that punishes everybody, lockdowns that encourages everyone to look suspiciously at anyone who won't take the vaccine or speaks out against the vaccine because you are preventing us from getting back to normal, me included. This is what they want. They want this intense pressure to accept the vaccine, paid for by your tax dollars. They are reaching into your pocket to get you to pay them to poison you with something you don't need. It doesn't matter even if it was just salt water. They're still robbing you. Whether they have other nefarious goals in mind physically for you is almost irrelevant. Of course, it matters if it's true, but it doesn't even matter to the fact that this is the biggest crime of inhumanity since the beginning of the planet Earth, since civilization. It's the biggest crime. It affects every man, woman, and child on the planet Earth. Has there ever been a crime bigger than that? No. Reading onwards. It was a magician's masterful use of misdirection to distract from the actual important facts of this story while heightening everyone's sense of vulnerability. She succeeded in telling exactly the opposite story told by the facts. She hijacked this infant's tragic death to craft an entirely different public message. Dr. Bonnie Henry is the one famously shedding tears for the TV cameras and gaining this emotional support of nearly the entire, all the citizens of British Columbia. Reading onwards. And her message is pretty difficult to criticize without coming off like a heartless monster that minimizes this infant's tragic death. No, it doesn't. The people who ordered these lockdowns, we will see soon how this plays out, where the connections are. They contributed to this child's death, and we're going to see that in great detail in a moment. So bear with me on this. These are just small excerpts from this article. Anyone who really wants to get down into the nitty-gritty of how this played out and how the facts, the data supports it, needs to read the whole study. Again, you better put a couple of hours aside. Reading from the top. Linking the sad fate of this infant to the risk posed to the other 1.7 million children and young adults under 30 living in the province is an unconscionable abuse of her authority and a dereliction of her duty to accurately educate the public of its risks. She spread misinformation by creating a false impression of what the underlying facts mean, by emphasizing and dramatizing some facts using extremely fearful and fear-inducing language, by withholding context, and by de-emphasizing the most important part of the story, a lie created without actually falsifying any data. This is how the most devious of lies are formed and spread. Let's read onwards. If anything, restaurants, schools, gyms, and retail stores produce the smallest cluster of cases if an outbreak does occur. But there is one category that should really spark your curiosity because it is missing altogether. Travel. Travel. We've been told that travel, even outside of your front door, puts everybody at risk. If you travel outside your front door, or God forbid, don't have a mask on, you're putting everybody at risk, including that child, including your grandparents. This is how they're whipping up the anger against anyone who opposes their carefully crafted narrative. This, folks, is the evil of evils of these people, the elite who are pushing this, for money. Money means control of the world. The more of the world you control, the closer you get to a one-world government controlled entirely by the elite. Entirely. With them being the emperor class, the ruling class, reducing everyone else in the world to a work-slave class. This is what the truly power-hungry megalomaniacs of humanity have always pursued, always, without exception, throughout our history. They are among us, they've always been among us, they always will be among us, and they're very active right now, in our time. Reading from the top. As you would expect, outbreaks in long-term care facilities and hospitals are much more dangerous, more deaths per outbreak, than outbreaks in the rest of the community. Outbreaks in schools, gyms, restaurants, local processing plants, personal care, etc. are essentially irrelevant to your statistical risk of dying because they cause so few deaths. And he has the data to back this up. The data is there in the government release. The government didn't highlight these things because the government is being controlled by the elite. The elite want you to be convinced you need to be locked in your home. But the data shows, and we talked about this a year ago, you didn't need this data, but here it is now just to drive the point home to obviousness. There was no point to the lockdowns from the beginning. In fact, we're going to see shortly that these lockdowns allowed the virus to persist longer, long enough for the vaccines to come out and for the elite to get their plan of billions upon billions of dollars, if not trillions, but certainly many billions directly from the vaccine. And we're not talking about all the incidental stuff like Amazon's incredible rise of profits. Let's read on. Of course, that shouldn't surprise us. Residents in long-term care facilities and patients in hospitals are obviously much more vulnerable than the rest of the population because they already have severe pre-existing diseases and or severely weakened immune systems. They wouldn't be hanging out in these settings if they weren't already sick and vulnerable before catching COVID. We talked about this a year ago. This was well known from the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. Reading onwards. I have highlighted this seemingly obvious statement because it is an important building block to understand the eye-popping layers that come later in this story. It foreshadows the first glimpse of the scandal, which will become clear and clearer as the layers add up. Bear with me. It takes very few infections to lead to an outbreak-linked death in a long-term care facility, 1 in 5. But boatloads of people can be infected in nail salons, no outbreak deaths, restaurants, only 1 in 1,004, churches, gyms, and stores, only 1 in 752, and schools in 1 in almost 10,000, while producing next to 0 fatalities. This we talked about a year ago. The at-risk population was clearly and well defined at the very beginning of the pandemic, and including the fact that the risk population were already behind institutionally government-controlled doors, health care facilities, long-term care facilities, and hospitals. They were already quarantining, in a sense. It would have been easy to protect them and close those doors as the pandemic spread through people for whom it would not hurt. And we've seen this in action every flu season. Every flu season for decades. We've rid them out in this exact same way, seeing the similar levels of death in the regular population. Anyways, let's read on. Living your life is not dangerous. Having a severe pre-existing health condition or a severely compromised immune system are necessary prerequisites before you have cause to worry. Reading onwards. Apparently, those who are sufficiently vulnerable to be at extreme risk of dying from a COVID infection are also already so sick and or so restricted in their ability to move about the community that very few of them are actually visiting any of these other locations. They are not in the restaurants. They don't work anymore. They're pretty much all retired. They don't go to gymnasiums. Most of them are 80-something years old. And yet all of those places were shut down. Why? They needed some leverage to get you to take the vaccine. You were locked down and told you can't come out until you get the vaccine. This is extortion. They extorted the entire world. The entire world. Along the way, they killed millions of people and destroyed businesses. Read onward here with me. Hold on to your hat. A full 97% of outbreak-related deaths are in long-term care and hospitals and health care. 97%. Add prison populations and that number rises to 98.6% of all the outbreak-related deaths. Let's read on. Anyone not hanging out in any one of these 3 settings faces an almost inconsequentially small level of risk from this virus, especially if you have no serious pre-existing health conditions. Reading onwards. Remember, there are also large numbers of people with equally serious pre-existing health conditions and compromised immune systems living outside of these 3 settings. But they are not dying in droves. This is very relevant. Perhaps even the majority of people with serious health conditions are still living at home. They're still living with their families. And they are not dying in droves despite being in the high-risk group. The high-risk group is not just the old and the infirm, but it's the old and the infirm who are living in government facilities, long-term care facilities, health care facilities. This is extremely interesting. You can have, and it's interesting to me because when I had the coronavirus back in December, We were going to go to the hospital, but I got to look in the hospital. They rejected me at a couple of hospitals because I was really quite bad. When I got to the general hospital here where they were going to take me in, I refused because I could see the condition of things in there, and I thought, you know, if I go in there, I have a higher risk of dying than if I just go back home and get taken care of in my own apartment. It was a good decision, but I think they probably would have killed me in there. Let's read on. Why are the vulnerable living outside of these three institutions not suffering the same fate? This is such an important question. And yet, you know what? Those people in government responsible for health portfolios are not asking this question. Why are they not asking this question? They don't want to know the answer to that. They probably do know. They just don't want to tell us. They're on the payroll. They're being given their marching orders. The eye-popping layers of this scandal begin here. The people inside these settings already live behind an institutional wall. They permanently live under some form of lockdown, even when the rest of society does not. Exactly what I pointed out over a year ago. The people who are vulnerable, they could close those doors. They're already in there. They don't have to move anywhere. They are already easy to quarantine because they are always quarantined. They're always under lockdown. And now what happens? We preserved this coronavirus's life by not allowing it to circulate as well as it could have and gain herd immunity last summer. Reading from the top. During bad winter flu season, staff of long-term care homes have the option to shut the doors and live on the inside with their patients for a few weeks while the worst of the flu surge passes through the population outside. Okay, reading from the top. 98.6% of all outbreak-linked deaths are the result of infections caught inside these institutional barriers. Inside. It's not coming from outside. It's being caught inside. Only 1.4% are linked to outbreaks in the community at large. Reading onward. At this point of the story, I'm sure it has become quite clear that just how specific this crisis is. Very, very specific. Despite the fact that the virus is clearly circulating on both sides of that institutional barrier, and he refers to the fact that these long-term care facilities and hospitals, they are like prisons in that there's a door in and a door out. That door can be shut and closed, and is at times, whenever the authorities controlled by the government decide to do so. So this is a physical barrier to these groups and institutional facilities controlled by government, including prisoners, and the rest of us. The vast majority of the deaths are linked to infections spreading on only one side of that barrier. Only one side. Cuomo, I think it was, in New York City found that out. Everybody who was getting the virus and dying was in these long-term care facilities. And what did he do? He put sick people in with them, deliberately. Forced people from the outside of the community, many of whom had the virus, to go into those communities, and it spread like wildfire inside. That's my understanding. Correct me if I'm wrong on that story. It's New York governor, or was it the New York City mayor? I can't remember. But anyways, look it up if you will, if I'm wrong on that. This is not a general population crisis. It is an institutional crisis, which explains to a large degree why they don't want to give us the specifics. They're hiding this fact. There is next to no risk to the population at general from this pandemic. Everything, and this puts it in perspective, 98-something% of the infections and deaths are happening in the institutions inside. This makes this virus less dangerous than the seasonal flu. He doesn't make this point in the article that I saw, but in fact it does, because the seasonal flu affects everybody outside the institution. It's not restricted to the inside. Over this year over year is a similar number of people have died from this so-called coronavirus as do die every year from the flu. The difference is This one is easier to control because it's not actually causing people to die outside of these institutions. Flu does every year, more. This virus doesn't. This was the easiest virus to control had it been done according to well-established pandemic control guidelines. But they threw them all away. Ask yourself that question. Why did the world leaders ignore the well-established, accepted guidelines for handling a global pandemic? Why did they? Follow the money. You know the answer to that. Reading onwards. The little numbers on the pie chart are the actual raw numbers of outbreak-linked deaths in Canada. Over 13,000 deaths linked to infections caught on the government side of the institutional divide, and only 178 deaths linked to infections on our side. This is outside in the regular world. 13,611 versus 178. Those are the hard numbers illustrating the differences of what is occurring on either side of that institutional divide. Here's the pie chart he was referring to. This is the deaths from normal population. These are the deaths inside those government institutions. Reading onward here. Blaming those on the outside of that institutional barrier for the disaster happening inside is a convenient distraction that allows the government to try to escape accountability. Think about that, folks. And that is exactly what they've been doing. Blaming those on the outside of that institutional divide. That divide which they control the door to, could close it down, lock it down, and protect inside to the complete of their abilities. But they didn't. Well, they did some closing of the doors, but they are blaming the people on the outside. Look at that naughty person out there on his front lawn without a mask. Well, there's another person jogging in a park without a mask. Somebody broke curfew somehow because the government decided that after 9 p.m. the virus is dangerous, but before 9 p.m. the virus isn't. Somebody's out after 9 p.m. They are to be blamed. Janice talked eloquently on this. They are to be blamed. They are creating targets of anger. They are blaming them for what's happening on the inside of government-controlled institutions where the danger really lies. Reading from the top. You could increase social distancing by 90 feet. You could make everyone wear 10 masks. The collateral damage to those living outside those institutional walls would become even more extreme than it already is. But 98.6% of the dying would continue anyway as long as the virus continues to circulate inside these institutional walls. That is exactly right. Inside. Reading from the top. By making the nuanced details of the epidemiological data so inaccessible to the general public, by refusing to have an honest debate with critics, by labeling everyone who tries to raise a concern as a conspiracy theorist, the government is deflecting from the fact that the government and not the general public is the one with marbles in its brains and blood on its hands. It is. He doesn't ask why. I ask why. Even at the risk of being called a conspiracy theorist, that doesn't matter to me. It's becoming a badge of honor. The why of it is money. Follow the money. And why money to the rich? Increase their control over the world. What do they want? What does total control over the world mean and look like? A one world government. That's what it looks like. That's what control leads to. And it's in the hands of a very, very small number of people. And they need to keep amassing their wealth, buying influence over the world. They got Donald Trump out of the way. They used the coronavirus pandemic to smear him and help not get him elected. They got their vaccines sold to governments all the way around the world. They helped Amazon double its profitability, and the tech companies also double their profitability, all of whom have been repressing the truth about the pandemic, including Fauci's lies and including the Wuhan lab culpability, which is coming to the surface now. Let's read onwards. Yet the large population of vulnerable elderly Canadians with multiple pre-existing conditions who live outside of institutions are not dropping like flies. So in other words, what I just mentioned earlier is in this article here. The vulnerable elderly with multiple pre-existing conditions that live outside the institutions are not dropping like flies. They are doing just fine. But God help those living under the government's care behind an institutional barrier. You can probably guess by now where I'm going to take this investigation next. How is it possible that almost all the deaths are stacked on one side, but almost all the people, including the vast majority of those who are extremely vulnerable, are stacked on the other side of this institutional barrier? Good question. A question that none of the officials are willing to look at or ask. A question that will get you labeled a conspiracy theorist. Unjustifiably. But that's why I suggest we should take conspiracy theorist as a badge of honor. I doubt that's going to fly in the popular world because they won't. The CIA and the officials are propping up this idea of conspiracy theorists. And the overwhelming number of people in the world just turn their mind off and they just nod along and believe, like in 1984, whatever those in power say is true. They just take it. They just take it in, swallow it whole, hook, line, and sinker, and go out attacking other people who don't get infected by their mind poison. Let's read from the top. The tightest lockdown in the country, that of institutions, where every move made by every person inside can be controlled, is proving worthless, despite being every central planner's dream come true. Yet every day, people that the government cannot control, but who are given information and retain the right to make their own choices about whether to leave their homes or bolt their front doors, are coming through this just fine. People making choices for themselves are coming through just fine. People who the government take into their control, are doing terribly. 75% of all deaths are linked to infections in institutional settings. Previously, he was talking about outbreak deaths. Now he's talking about all deaths, whether it's during an outbreak, a wave, a so-called wave or whatever. All deaths are in institutional settings, 75%. Reading from the top. It also is worthwhile to reflect back on the 14.5 million Canadians who have traveled into Canada since the pandemic began. I don't know where you got that number. I presume it's in the statistics released by the government, but apparently 14.5 million returning Canadians. Maybe these are some of them are multiple trips out of the country coming back. Travel didn't even warrant its own category in the outbreak data, despite all the PCR testing and contact tracing that focused almost exclusively on travelers throughout the first wave of this pandemic. That's real data, folks. There is no measurable contribution to the outbreaks and to the deaths due to traveling outside of the country. And yet, what have we have here? Total lockdown of the borders. Why? Until you get the vaccine, you can't have your freedom back. Until you get the vaccine, you can't have your freedom back. You're being locked down in order to coerce you into getting the vaccines, in order for governments to give contracts to these vaccine manufacturers in China and in Africa that Bill Gates owns and supports. You're being blackmailed. It's extortion. You're being extorted. Yet the tiny population of only 292,000 people living inside institutions, one-fiftieth of the number of travelers, managed to rack up 75% of all deaths. 75%. I'm going to pause here for a moment and recognize Sean Tower. Thank you again, Sean, for your generous contributions to Studio Burley. Steve, look up Wendy Kirkland, reported by Rebel. I don't recognize the name, but if you have a link, Sean, for sure, stick it in the comments, would you? Thank you very much. Let's read onwards. On January 29th, 2020, as health authorities first began to take notice of the virus spreading around the world, Canada's Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Theresa Tam, warned that, and you need to read this quote with me, the epidemic of fear could be more difficult to control than the epidemic itself. You don't say. And that any measures that a country is to take must not be out of proportion to the risk. Wow, did we ever depart from that? This must be before the elite got to Trudeau and told Trudeau to get Dr. Theresa Tam on the right track, the track of spreading fear and hysteria, and the track of locking down the country, extorting the Canadians into taking the vaccine. This is the biggest crime against humanity in the history of civilization. Dr. Tam correctly identified that the greatest risk of pandemic management is fear itself. Yet in the months that followed, her warning turned into a prophecy, driven in no small part by her own public messaging. She was not told what to say early enough. And now those words are coming back to haunt her. They're revealing the truth of this pandemic. Reading from the top. The measures used by the government during COVID are off the chart. Contact tracing, quarantine of exposed individuals, entry screening at buildings and stores. Every place you go now, they're taking your temperature. They won't let you in without a mask. Your mask is your default passport. It's getting you used to having to earn your way or prove your way into any facility. It's conditioning. And border closures are not to be used under any circumstance. Not only do these off-the-chart measures not work, i.e. experience shows that by the time you close the border, the virus is already circulating inside. That is true. They also heighten fear, which risks triggering panic in the population, which is what they wanted. They wanted fear. They want you locked down. The fear remind you to be afraid by having you force everybody to see everybody around you wearing a mask. Remind you by telling you can't travel. You get so many things you can't do. Telling you that a sick baby who got sicker in the hospital is due to COVID-19 virus. All of their messaging is about ramping up the fear, justifying their emergency powers, which are illegal, and then locking you in your homes, preventing you from having a regular life until you get the vaccine. Reading onwards. The fact that government also used workplace closures, internal travel restrictions, and school closures would all suggest that we faced a pandemic of high or extraordinary severity. 24,402 deaths. Sounds like a lot, right? You be the judge. Let's have a look at the real numbers. Total deaths per 100,000 population in Canada, February 20th, 2011 to February 6th, 2021. That is 10-year period, 1 decade worth of deaths. Total deaths per 100,000. Watch the trend here, okay? We're up at 700 per 100,000. And including both waves of the pandemic, we're looking at about 800 people per 100,000. So, and over that period, there's some that it behooves us. We're going to have a look at some details there as to why it's even less severe than this shows right here. Let's read on. The best analogy, however brutal it may be, is to compare it with the dry tinder that builds up in a forest waiting for a spark. In other words, there's a cycle. There's more deaths one year from seasonal flus and their associated illnesses, and then it'll be a year of low and a year of high, maybe 2 years of low, and so on. It goes on like this. And this is why it goes on like this. This is totally predictable. After a big fire, the forest becomes relatively fire resistant until enough fresh tinder builds up again. In a flu season, the tinder is, sad to say, the population of vulnerable citizens living, especially but not exclusively, those living in long-term care facilities, where it is particularly challenging to prevent the virus from spreading among residents if it gets inside. So a significant amount of the slightly higher numbers of this past year are due to that we had 2 years of slightly lower numbers. The tinder there wasn't enough tinder for the fire to take off in those intervening 2 years. So this, in other words, this past year would have been slightly higher than the previous 2 years, even if the coronavirus was not released from that Wuhan lab. That's not, we're not even talking about how they mischaracterized many of the coronavirus deaths. Let's read from the top. COVID comes on the heels of 2 milder years following the deadly winter flu of 2017-2018. I provide many examples in this article demonstrating how badly hospitals were overflowing during the 2017-2018 flu season. The virus is real, but it is far from a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic like the 1918 Spanish flu. He's absolutely right there. In other words, reading from the top, what Dr. Albert de Villiers is pointing out is that many COVID deaths are deaths with but not from COVID. This is further into the article. People who died of other causes but also had a positive PCR test even if they showed no symptoms from COVID itself, including people already receiving palliative care. These are people who are dying imminently within days or weeks, and there is no longer anything that can be done to stop it. But they even went further than that, classifying a motorcycle accident in Florida, amongst other things, as a coronavirus death, cause of death, coronavirus. We can't even, even though the slight raise in statistics is indicated here, we can't even trust that that is due to coronavirus. We can't trust it because we're being lied to at every stage of this pandemic. Mass PCR testing has never been used before to test all nursing home patients for the presence of respiratory viruses, regardless of their underlying cause of death. It is a well-known phenomenon that the immune systems of people who are nearing the end of their lives are essentially in the process of shutting down. So in other words, this is normal for people in the process of dying, a process that can take some time, that their immune system shutting down, more viruses will be found. But they never looked for those other viruses in other years or even now. They only looked for COVID-19, and that allowed them to classify the death as COVID-19, pushing up the fear, creating hysteria, justifying lockdowns, travel restrictions on regular healthy people at zero risk, and extorting you, holding you prisoner until you agree to take the vaccine. This is the biggest crime against humanity in human history. Reading onwards. Dying is a process, not a one-day event. As their immune system slowly shuts down, they become increasingly susceptible to picking up all sorts of viruses. In many cases, the presence of the virus is merely a sideshow to the actual cause of death. This guy here is making excellent points. He's making points that the health professionals should be making, but aren't. Why aren't they? Reading from the top. If you did mass PCR testing of nursing home patients for all the other respiratory issues, viruses that cause colds and flus, and there are hundreds, you would find tons of them. You would. But they're not going to use any one of those others as a cause of death. They only used COVID-19 as a registered cause of death. Reading from the top. And if you decided to ignore all this context and simply started doing mass PCR testing for influenza virus and palliative care patients using the lax case definition used for COVID, and then gave the virus a fancy name and kept a running case count and death count on the front pages of newspapers, you would be able to create mass panic just like we have today every single winter. Every single winter. The difference is that we were all accustomed to the flu. It's hard to sell something extremely dangerous when we're all familiar with it. We've all had several cases of the flu. I don't even know how many times I've had the flu in my life. I know some people die of it. I also know those people dying of it usually are weakened in other ways. Let's read on. The misuse of a diagnostic aid to do mass PCR testing of every patient and every death in long-term facilities and hospitals is unethical. It is scientific fraud. The Faucis of the world know this. And it is a criminal breach of trust in light of the illusion of mass dying that it creates. Fauci knows this. This is a fraud. The biggest crime in the history of humanity, the biggest crime against humanity. Reading from the top, the Toronto Sun says, the Public Health Agency of Canada confirmed that only 36.6% of children hospitalized with COVID were actually admitted with a COVID infection. In other words, a full 63.4% of children were admitted to hospital for treatment for other non-COVID health issues and caught COVID while they were on the inside of the hospital. Hospital transmission, not community transmission. Just like the infant in Dr. Henry's propaganda masterpiece. Folks, you're starting to see just how intricately deceptive all of those involved have been in this. And you know why? They've been told to tell this story. This narrative has been crafted. It's been crafted from the top. The elite, most powerful people of the world crafted this narrative and kept it going. Here are the weekly deaths in Canada for the past, from January 3rd, 2010 to January 6th, 2021, for a decade here. And you can see winter flu spikes. Some years are bigger than others for the reason we talked about, the idea of the tinder in the forest after a forest fire. During a big flu season, this is the 2017-2018 one here that he talked about. Let me expand this up for you. This one was particularly deadly. Notice that in the year after, it was much less. And then there was just much less here again. So the tinder was allowed to build up in the forest, so to speak. And there was a higher rate of vulnerable elderly. Here's the first wave of the COVID panic, the COVID virus. Here's the second wave. Notice that statistically, there's been a rise in viruses and the severity of the number of deaths due to viruses for a decade, almost in a continuous straight line. And if you analyze that statistical data, there's not really any statistical difference between this peak, and these other peaks, other than the fact that there's a long-term trend of rising numbers of deaths as a result of seasonal flu. That's a different story. we should ask about. And I'll be willing to bet, I'll speculate this right off the bat. I'd say I'm not going to necessarily bet, but I'll speculate that what we also see in that decade period is that the percentage of people in the elderly population is rising at about that rate too in the Canadian and across the country in Canada. The percentage of people who are over the age of 65 with existing illnesses is rising. So this rising trend of number of deaths per flu season may simply be reflecting the aging population of the country. Let's read on. The first two COVID waves of 2019, 2020, and the 2021 winter seasons are recognizable on the chart, but do not stand out from the pack. A glance to the left shows that there are between 5,000 and 6,000 deaths per week in Canada, every single week of the year of all causes. One of the mysteries of the COVID pandemic has been the disappearance of the winter flu. This is very, very important. COVID is now playing the role that influenza used to play. Flu deaths have been displaced by COVID deaths. Yep. And they're not standing out as in total numbers year over year. Reading onwards. A remarkable article published in the Telegraph May 14th, 2021 reports that a group of scientists have admitted to using of fear to control people's behavior during the COVID pandemic. Have a read of that article. What these health officials and scientific advisory boards have done is not just shameless exploitation, it is scientific fraud with real, serious, and deadly consequences for all those whose lives are being destroyed by lockdowns. Not to mention the increased risk that people are assuming by accepting a untested vaccine, a non-approved vaccine with messenger RNA injected into their bodies. These are people with zero risk of coronavirus taking on additional risk of the vaccine. We've talked about this before. Let's read in the top. Flatten the curve was just a noble-sounding euphemism for keep the vulnerable at risk for more than 15 months by preventing the community from building a protective ring of natural herd immunity around them. Exactly what I talked about a year ago. We should have had herd immunity last summer. But you can't make billions or trillions of dollars off of naturally formed herd immunity, now can you? Follow the money. Read from the top with me. Yet, if the government had followed the pandemic planning guidelines and provided focused protection for the vulnerable, while allowing the virus to spread among the rest of society as the winter flu does every winter, then the vulnerable would have been able to get back to their lives after 6 to 8 weeks of carefully guarding their doors. Simple, well understood, and even written up in official, I think, World Health Organization approved pandemic procedures, totally thrown out the door shortly after the pandemic arrived. Why? Follow the money. Follow the money. The key to protecting the vulnerable is to dry up the virus outside. Outside, he means outside of the institutional barrier, the doors of all those government-controlled institutions, where the rest of us all live our everyday lives. The gross negligence of abandoning pandemic planning guidelines has ensured that it is still there. Exactly. Gross negligence may be the reason why this infant's death was entirely preventable. Well, he's being generous, in my opinion. I don't think this is gross negligence. I think this is deliberate culpability. The people making these decisions, many of them have scientific training. Many of them were speaking out of the other side of their mouth before they were told to toe the line and drive up the fear and hysteria and panic. This is direct culpability. They took active decisions. They took actions that caused these outcomes. It's not gross negligence. Not in my opinion. By extending this period over 15 months, thousands of people who were not vulnerable during first wave have now been added to the ranks of the vulnerable, perhaps because they became ill with cancer or leukemia or heart disease. So this is another point he's making. Had these people, let's say someone newly gets some kidney cancer or some respiratory disease in December of last year. Had we allowed herd immunity to develop naturally, and it would have, over the summer, they would have been exposed on the outside to the virus itself, developed immunity to it before they got sick with other life-threatening illnesses. They probably would have survived it. But instead, they got exposed to the virus after getting other illnesses and became subject to being killed by the virus, and probably driving the numbers up. Read from the top with me. Because many of these once healthy but now sick individuals did not acquire herd immunity while they were, that was I was just saying, but yeah, read this from his thing. Let's go over it again. Because many of these once healthy but now sick individuals did not acquire herd immunity while they were still healthy during the first wave, they did not bring any immunity with them to long-term care homes and hospitals, and they do not have the necessary immunity to fight off COVID if they catch it now that they are weak. By denying them the chance to get exposed to the virus while they were strong, they now face a significantly higher risk of death if they are exposed to it while they are weak. And they didn't just ignore guidelines. Remember that these are the people who should know this stuff. Making the decisions, going completely against scientific knowledge, against pandemic planning rules, against the evidence, and causing deaths in order to push people to take vaccines, driving money to the elite. They systematically and knowingly, and they didn't just ignore guidelines, they systematically and knowingly violated our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is meant to act as the ultimate buffer against this kind of do-it-yourself rule-making. Section 1 of the Charter places the burden of proof on the government to justify any limits to put on our rights and freedoms in a court of law before it has the right to impose those limits. None of the governments of the Western world did that. Like I mentioned at the beginning and many times before, there was never a case made for lockdowns, and no one even asked for a case to be made for lockdowns. The government just did it illegally. They were told to do it. Bill Gates himself, only one of the elites, his numbers alone spent $500 million lobbying for lockdowns, and lobbying for lockdowns on that to remain in place until you take the vaccine, until they've sold their vaccines, until you've paid their ransom with your health. This is the biggest crime against humanity in the history of humanity. Let's read on. The legal process required for the government to pass this burden of proof is called the Oakes test. There's a link in the article to that. It is meant to force politicians, health officials, and scientists through a gauntlet of debate and evidence-based discussion and stop them from engaging in ad hoc rulemaking, which is what we got in spades now. Throwing up lockdowns and curfews and restrictions and shutting down businesses at willy-nilly. Why? It all drives money to the elites. All of it drives money to the elites. And you can bet each one of these officials in government quarters expects to be rewarded handsomely for playing their role in destroying your lives and enriching the pockets of the elite. Let's read on. This never happened. This never happened. A case was never made for emergency powers. A case was never made for lockdowns. A case was never made for mandatory masks. A case was never made for mandatory vaccines. A case was never made for shutting down the borders. But all of it just casually walked through. The biggest crime against humanity in the history of humanity. And because every other country is doing it too, it normalized the idea that our inalienable individual rights have been downgraded to conditional individual rights. I might remind you that you have no rights that you aren't willing to defend. If you're not willing to defend and exercise those rights, they do not exist. You've given them up. Imagine if they succeed in disarming or making guns illegal in the US. Just where the government will go with that. But that's another topic for another story, another day. Reading from the top. I shall begin with the fear caused by face masks, whose effectiveness has no demonstrable basis in science, but which have served to create a constant visual reminder of danger and heighten the public's sense of fear. Fauci himself, in his emails just coming out recently, told the public, in his emails, revealed that he does not believe the face masks do anything. That was before the emails were made public. He was then telling us all to put on face masks, 2 face masks, 3 face masks. On and on it goes. Just face masks, by the way, cause other problems, especially when they're not cleaned properly. Even in the hospitals, medical officials, trained people don't wear a face mask for more than about 20 minutes. They change it to a new one if they're in surgery, for instance. But they don't work for viruses. Viruses are far too small for these face masks. Reading from the top, evaluating the vaccine as an exit strategy. This was and I'll remind you guys, we talked about this over a year ago, and we went over it, some of those same slides a couple days ago. Bill Gates and his crowd were saying that we cannot lift lockdowns until everyone is vaccinated from within 2 or 3 weeks of the lockdowns. They were lobbying for this. You must get the vaccine. And it's just a coincidence that Bill Gates and his friends stand to become extremely more wealthy than they already are if they can get governments to force this. Well, they succeeded. And we see where the money is. The opportunity cost of waiting for a vaccine and ignoring the pandemic planning guidelines. We're getting close to the end on this, folks, so bear with me. There's still some very important stuff to come. Despite the rollout being underway, there are still no long-term safety trials since they are still ongoing. They finish in 2024. The long-term safety trials of this new technology, messenger RNA vaccine technology, won't be finished for 3 more years. And yet they've granted immunity to all of the companies who are selling these vaccines. All of this done under the insistence that it's necessary because there's an emergency powers. And all the emergency powers were taken illegally, without justification, without scientific evidence to support it. That is why vaccines required emergency use authorizations. What are the long-term trials? We are the long-term trial. That's right. The whole world, everyone that takes this vaccine, has signed up to be a guinea pig. A guinea pig that they will then use to learn what their new technology can really do, this messenger RNA technology. Reading from the top. Coercion is being used to force compliance, which is a violation under the Nuremberg Code. Full text available in the notes at the bottom of this investigative report. And we are on the cusp of introducing vaccine passports. I'm not sure if they're going to be able to make this fly because there is significant resistance. But this idea is being pushed up the pole in countries all the way around the world. Israel had it for a long time, and they just recently canceled it. Maybe because of public pressure, I don't know. This is a Chinese-style social credit score system for government-approved behavior promoted under the guise of safety, safety, a four-letter safe, a four-letter word. It's used to destroy anything that you might enjoy or need in your life. And introduced as a precondition to participating in normal life. It's Orwellian in the extreme. Yes, it is. Indeed, it is. Vaccination increased deaths even before they arrived, because by pinning our hopes on them, we suffered through 15 months of lockdowns and an additional second wave instead of going through a single 6 to 8 week wave with focused protection for the vulnerable, as we would every year for a normal winter flu. It may be the deadliest vaccine in history, not because of the vaccine itself, but because of the terrible cost of maintaining endless lockdowns while we waited for them to arrive. It's a good point. And he's not even mentioning the suicides, the increased drug use, the loss of businesses and the destruction of life and the violence and the riots and of course like that, which were not really related to the coronavirus, but were given a pass through all this period. Vaccination is never a guaranteed zero-risk medical procedure, regardless of its benefits. No medical procedure is, but... So why are people who have already had COVID not being excluded from vaccination in order to shield them from exposure to this demonstrable risk? And that research report that I flashed up at the beginning deals with just exactly this topic, that your exposure to COVID-19 in the past does give you protection. So why are they being forced to take on additional risk of the vaccine? I have not taken the vaccine yet. I have no intention of taking the vaccine for now. And I have several reasons for this. One is that I can still do what everybody else does here without a vaccine. Two is that I don't trust it. I don't want to be a guinea pig. But I have to admit, if they are showing signs of doing this, they may exclude me from everything, from being able to do anything here if I don't have the proof of a vaccination. And if they do that, I'm going to have to make a decision, like everybody else. Am I going to pay my ransom and take this vaccine, become a guinea pig, and get out to go free? Because they do have the power to stop me from going to the grocery store, from traveling on a plane, from doing anything at all in civilization. And as much as I don't like to admit it, or that we all need to admit this, we're social animals. We live in a complex society. If you are excluded from that complex society, you do not thrive. Not very well. Some people can argue that you can go and live in the woods, all by yourself, with all being self-sufficient. I don't think that's really possible, or not very satisfying. So that it becomes a decision. Am I going to accept being forced into the vaccine? I'm going to hold out. I'll put it this way. I'm going to hold out as long as I can, because the vaccine comes with risks, more risks. I've already had the COVID-19 coronavirus. I've got some level of immunity. So I'm not going to take it. I'm going to wait and see what happens to all the other people in the world who are taking it. And even then, even if I'm not going to take it unless there's some good reason that I should take a vaccine. I've taken vaccines in the past. I'm not afraid of vaccines, but I am suspicious of this vaccine, and with good reason. This one has not been through the full test protocols, and it's a new technology, and it's for a virus which does not have the level of risk that they are claiming it to. There's just way too many other overriding factors here to inject yourself with this vaccine. At the end of the day, I don't know if they're going to succeed, because here's another possibility, folks. Just like Israel with its vaccine passport and then canceling it, getting 90% of the people having a vaccine passport, and then boom, they just say, well, we're just going to cancel it. You can do whatever you want, no matter your vaccine status. That could happen in every single country around the world. And I have a sneaking suspicion it just might, because the bad publicity is starting to rise up in their circles. So they may want to sweep this one under the rug and try again with a different pandemic in the future, which would mean that I wait out here for a couple of months. Maybe they lock down things and I try to ride it out, get my groceries delivered. And then after a couple of months of lockdown, they say, there's no more money to be had by locking down the people, so let's cancel it. Everybody can travel about freely. And they'll come up with some bonehead excuse as to why it's safe to do so now. That's not the point. The point will be that they sold all the vaccines that they can sell for now. And they want to avoid bad publicity and let people forget about this round of tyranny that they pushed through the entire world. And then I will be free of a vaccine and get through this thing without taking the vaccine. I'm not telling you what to do. I can't do that. If I do, YouTube will probably can't delete my video. So I'm just telling you what I'm going to do. I'm not taking the vaccine. They're doing other coercive techniques here now because it's free right now, but they're telling us that if you don't take it by the end of the month, that you're going to have to pay 7,000 pesos for it. I'm not taking it by the end of the month. They will have to enact some pretty severe restrictions before I'll take it. And I know people who have taken it specifically because they weren't allowed to go in. For instance, a guy had a job coaching kids at a sports, working at a sports arena here, and they wouldn't let him start his job without taking the vaccine. So he took the vaccine. As a Dominican fellow. So there's all kinds of coercive techniques that they will use. And I'm going to just have to play it day by day, and I'm hoping that I can get through this up to the point where they'll cancel the requirements because they've already profited all their profit out of it, and I will have escaped without the vaccine. That's my strategy. Each his own. And I'll have to admit too, though, if I was in a vulnerable group, if I was 75 years old with 3 different serious health problems, and the vaccine had been issued and not too many side effects, and then if the risk of the getting the virus was, I judge it to be high, I might take the vaccine, but I'm not in that category. So I'm suggesting that every one of you should make your own decisions on this and have your own strategy around it. Let's read from the top. All of these people already have immunity, so they had no risk to offset by further exposing themselves to the potential risks of immunization. People with pre-existing immunity are not a small percentage of the population. Up to 80% of people in Germany already have this pre-existing cross-reactive immunity, though it varies greatly from country to country. Again, I'll direct you to that study that I released, flashed up at the beginning of this video. It talks about this pre-existing cross-reactive immunity. There are people with built-up immunity for this virus. Lots of them. In other words, vaccination and its associated risks could be reduced by up to 80% simply by doing antibody testing and testing for cross-reactive immunity. They're not, the medical community, the science community is not being upfront with people about this information. Why? Because the goal here is to sell as many vaccines, experimental vaccines, as possible. And use the whole world as guinea pigs. We're just the work slave class to the elite. Don't for a minute think that they see us as equal human beings to them. They don't. These group of people will happily cause the deaths of millions or even billions of people and have a cup of tea and go straight to sleep every night. We, to them, are human resources. We are not human beings first to them. We are human resources to them. Our value to them is how we can serve them. Let's read from the top. Dr. Henry's propaganda story of April 19th, 2021. Only a single individual under the age of 30 had died with or from COVID in British Columbia. One under 30. And that infant had pre-existing conditions. So a single vaccine-linked death in British Columbia of a healthy individual without pre-existing conditions under the age of 30 would make the vaccine more lethal than the virus to those under 30s in British Columbia. So you see what he's suggesting here, which is true. He's quite accurate in this. And I think there probably has, I don't know for sure, in British Columbia, but there have been deaths due to the vaccine. If there has been one in British Columbia, even one under 30, that one death would make the vaccine more lethal than the COVID virus itself. Are these facts being shared as part of informed consent? You know they are not. They absolutely are not. This is not just any normal level of fraud here, and it's certainly not gross negligence. This is deliberately planned scam. Reading from the top. Vaccination of the healthy only makes sense if the healthy are being bowled over in large number by this virus. Everything in this investigative report shows that that is not the case. There is absolutely no case to be made that this virus is the dangerous emergency pandemic that the elite want us to believe. Zero case to be made. Reading from the top. In a free society, it's not up to someone else to decide what risks you should be forced to take. And it is not acceptable to coerce anyone into a personal medical decision. We are not cattle to be shepherded into compliance. Well, to the elite you are. To the elite, that is exactly what you are. That is exactly why we are seeing them do it. That is exactly why those in political power, in our governments, and in our leaders in the scientific community are towing the line. Because their pay bosses are pulling the strings. And you exactly are, to those pay bosses, cattle to be shepherded into compliance, guinea pigs to be used in medical experiments. Let's read on. When government goes all in on one strategy, all others are pushed aside. The sorry tale of ivermectin and its unpopular friends. It's getting towards the end here. There is a lot of details, and he covers a lot of different stuff in this. And mind you, I want to remind you that I'm only covering a small fraction of this article and report here. It's been long already, well over an hour, but this is really just a small fraction of what he's compiled as a case against this corrupt scandal. There are hundreds of promising studies published on ivermectin, bromhexine, hydroxychloroquine, vitamin D, and countless others, both for treatment and to use as a prophylaxis to prevent COVID-19. And I talked about many of these things in previous episodes. Despite the air of caring radiating from Dr. Henry's seemingly empathetic concern for our well-being, she was nonetheless willing to knowingly reduce the infant in her story to a mere propaganda tool. Don't be fooled by those tears of hers. Don't be fooled by those tears. She's a fraud. She's a manipulative agent. She's supposed to be a doctor. If she didn't know everything that he said and everything that I've spoken about since the very beginning of this pandemic, then how on earth is she a doctor? This is not even advanced science. This is not even advanced medicine we're talking about here. Most of what we've talked about as how to manage this kind of a virus is well known. Let's read from the top. And she is just one of thousands of health officials, scientists, and politicians around this country and across the world that have knowingly played this despicable game of deception. It is one thing to be swept up in mass hysteria. It is quite another to knowingly play chess with the truth and gamble with other people's lives in order to intentionally fuel hysteria to engineer some alleged greater good. Part of that greater good that these lefties have been pushing for 100 years is the one world government. It's why they push the climate change agenda so high. Everything they push up they characterize it as an existential threat to humanity that can only be addressed by a one world government. And if you remember, back in the very beginning of this pandemic, Henry Kissinger, Gordon Brown, many other high-profile leaders of the world were saying exactly that. The only way to attack the coronavirus pandemic is to enact a one world government. Their Great Reset at the World Economic Forum talks on the same lines, a one world government. So, this greater good has been their obsession, this quote, greater good, the one world government, has been these same people's obsession for 100 years, to turn themselves into emperors and princes, prancing around the world with absolute power, while the rest of us are reduced to cattle, livestock, human resources, work slaves. Use which word you want, but that's how they view us. National Review. Researcher tied to Wuhan lab thanked Fauci for dismissing lab leak theory. This came out June 1st of this year. Now that's the end of that particular report, folks. That's not the end of the report, but that's the end of the clips that I have from it. There's more in the report. If you have the time and the energy to work through it, it's worth your effort. It's a slog, I'll admit. But anyways, I tried to give you a good sense of his argument with the clips that I took from that report. Let's read onwards here. This Peter Daszak, a zoologist whose nonprofit steered U.S. funding to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, thanked Anthony Fauci for pushing back on the theory that the coronavirus leaked from a lab in an April 2020 email published as part of the Freedom of Information Act. This is just more of the fraud of Fauci here. There was a study recently where a group of highly qualified evolutionary virologists looked at the sequences there and the sequences in the bats as they evolved, Fauci said at the time. The mutations that it took to get to the point where it is now is totally inconsistent with a jump from a species from animal to human. He's lying. We went over this just last week, I believe, or as earlier this week. Bill Gates. I want to go over some stuff from before now. Bill Gates, optimistic about COVID-19 recovery by cooperating with partners including China. Bill Gates is implicated in every story, every one of these fake stories and conspiracies. His name always comes up. This was back in September 16th. Bill Gates was propping up China. Bill Gates, co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, has called for closer global cooperation to cope with COVID-19 pandemic on Tuesday, while recognizing China has an indispensable role in joint efforts to help the world address health and development challenges, trying to persuade the world to accept China as a central leader in this. And now we know that the Wuhan lab and the Chinese government, the Wuhan lab is the most likely source of the virus. It was an engineered virus, a virus under research for gain of function. And the Chinese government did everything in their power to prevent researchers from looking into it. In April, the World Health Organization, governments around the world, and other partners, including Bill Gates Foundation, launched Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, a global collaboration to develop diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines to make sure that they were delivered equitably to those who need them the most, no matter where they live or how little money they have. Bill Gates profiting off of all of that. Gates notes, in China, speeding towards the future. In September 2010, I traveled through China to visit with vaccine makers, computer scientists, technology companies, and car manufacturers. This is in 2011. Bill Gates' connections in China and Africa are very, very strong. Third world countries in which they're making vaccines. Okay, here he is talking about lower cost versions to make vaccines and getting them involved in inventing vaccines. Moving to China, Brazil, India, China. Global in nature, his interest in these vaccines. And Bill Gates, China is reliable Time for collaboration on COVID-19. This is as April 30th, 2020. He was already propping up China as the central player for this, to be trusted. And we know exactly how little we can trust the Chinese government now. And again, I want to remind you, all of this in the backdrop of what's happening now, over 2 billion vaccine doses have been administered worldwide. That's administered, not just sold. Many times that are likely already sold in contracts for future delivery. Sold and probably paid for by our governments around the world. Why is Bill Gates always involved in these things? 9 executives from these companies have become new billionaires. And these are just the sergeants, the captains, running the show for the super elite. Now, I'm going to shift gears a little bit here because this is relevant, believe it or not. As we saw recently, we're seeing a rise of ransomware coming up. 2 incidents of ransomware that I recently, I'm sure you've heard about. One was on the oil pipeline in the U.S. at the same time as which Biden removed all roadblocks to help Russia build oil pipelines that will enrich them. Not only did he cut out the Keystone oil pipeline, but the U.S. was hit with ransomware on another pipeline that had to be shut down. The next ransomware was on meat production, beef production. This is interesting to me, quite interesting to me, because we've looked at this topic from a different angle earlier this year, or last year, during this pandemic, in fact, this thing was still going on. So Bill Gates is about to change the way. This is a little reminder here. America Farms. The co-founder of Microsoft and his wife make an auspicious debut in 2020 Land Report as America's largest private farmland owners. This is January 15th of this year. Here, Bill Gates speaks highly of China epidemic control measures in April and early in April. I think that's out of place, that particular one, but anyways, let's have a look here. This is very interesting too. The WHO whitewash, the investigating body that went to China a year after the Wuhan lab release. Okay, China blocked it and then severely controlled the researchers when they went to do the investigation in February. Investigators back, these same investigators, they're so-called scientists, back China's claim that Australian beef could have caused COVID-19 and demand there be no further study of the theory that it came from a Wuhan lab. I think this was in the Daily Mail. Imagine that, out of the World Health Organization, run by Tedros, who was put into the leader of the World Health Organization by the lobbying of China. Bill Gates, in deep with the World Health Organization, a big fan and investor in China and India and Brazil and Africa for vaccine makers. We're going to find out more about Bill Gates' plan for beef too. But here they are claiming that Australian beef caused COVID-19. Trying to throw a fear into the entire world. They've got the whole world whipped up in a fear of COVID-19. Irrational fear of COVID-19, absolute hysteria. And now they're trying to make the claim that it's in the beef supply. Imagine what that would do if they could make that fly to the beef industry in the world. Imagine what that would do. Keep this in mind as we go over some of these next slides. Bill Gates, February 16th, I think this was this year, says rich countries should be eating 100% synthetic beef. Isn't that interesting? The investigative team backs up China, tells you can't look at Wuhan lab anymore as a source, and it might have come from Australian beef. Well, what great timing for Bill Gates that is. This is amazingly good timing. Bill Gates just happens to be investing in synthetic beef. So many coincidences just always line up in Bill Gates' favor and his elites. Beyond Meat's stock is wildly overpriced even if business expands perfectly. So it's overpriced. What do they need? They need to build up that demand for synthetic beef. How do you do that? Well, you got to restrict the supply of natural beef. This is May 10th, 2020, folks. May 10th, 2020. The world's first 3D printed lab-grown ribeye steak is unveiled and changing in America. Cultured meat startup Aleph Farms raises $12 million. Where do you think that $12 million came from? That was in June of 2019. Consumer demand for protein continues to be very strong. That means there's an opportunity for plant and cultured protein growth to complement our traditional animal protein portfolio, says this person from Cargill. Cargill invested in another cultured meat producer, Memphis Meats, with a group of funders that included Bill Gates and Richard Branson. Let's keep reading on. Bill Gates and Richard Branson are betting lab-grown meat might be the food of the future. March 23, 2018. Bill Gates warns that manufacturing could challenge climate goals. Manufacturing in 2021, just recently. On a personal note, Gates says, this is in that article on that previous title, in his book that after years of dismissing activists' call to divest from fossil fuels, he sold his direct holdings in oil and gas companies in 2019. The Gates Foundation's endowment did the same, but not because Gates became convinced that divestment would push companies toward clean energy. So Bill Gates, not concerned really about clean energy, but he does get rid of his oil and gas. So he's basically, all of his moves, like this one, are about money, profitability. Bill Gates has never been about these lofty goals of saving the planet. He doesn't even believe that, if you ask me. He doesn't believe that we're in an existential threat. He just sees the opportunity to become even richer, to become possibly among the first ruling class of the whole planet Earth. And what do we have? Bill Gates has invested in farmland, invested in synthetic beef, and has divested himself of all oil products, amongst other things. He's profited handsomely off of the pandemic by encouraging or insisting on lockdowns, lobbying for lockdowns, and having those lockdowns in place until everyone's vaccinated. And in the face of all this, we see JBS cyber attack. From gas to meat, hackers are hitting the nation and consumers where it hurts. Another incredibly convenient coincidence for Bill Gates, who just happens to have divested himself of investment in energy, gas, and invested in alternatives to meat. The cyber attackers attacked gas and meat. Sure, circumstantial evidence, but it's always amazing to me how all the coincidences of the world line up in a line to drop more dollars in Bill Gates and his buddies' pockets every single time. This was just June 2nd, 2021. Let's read onwards. Key points. The ransomware attack on meat processing giant JBS raises the issue of food security as a national security threat caused by criminal hacking. Well, we've got a pandemic that's an existential threat, and Bill Gates has the vaccines. How convenient for him. Now we have the media whipping up that food security is a national security threat after a cyber attack on a meat plant, and who has investments in synthetic meat. Bill Gates. It was just a month ago that the U.S. faced ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline, which escalated energy security concerns and led to panic buying of gas by consumers. And it just so happens that Bill Gates and his buddies are seriously investing in alternative energy sources, especially for cars. The recent targeted attacks on critical infrastructure controlled by private enterprise are a strategic ploy by hackers to hit companies at key points in supply chains and more effectively leverage ransom demands, and there are consequences in commodities and consumer markets. Let's read on. The psyche and everyday lives of Americans. Ransomware attacks take down major energy and food supply infrastructure and raise fears about being able to buy key consumer commodities like gas and meat at affordable prices. And in comes synthetic meat. Bill Gates just happens to have the farms too to generate whatever he needs for his synthetic meats. Reading from the top. A month ago, the hack of the Colonial Pipeline, which controls 45% of fuel in the eastern U.S., led to panicked buying of gas. This week's ransomware attack on the world's biggest meat processing company, JBS, escalated concerns about the potential for a spike in meat prices and food supply as a national security threat. Spike in meat prices certainly makes synthetic meat more competitive. Let's read on. This attack demonstrates the reach of these events, shutting down meat plants in Australia. Remember that the team investigating the coronavirus in Japan accused Australia meat as being a likely source of the coronavirus. If they got that one to stick, which they didn't, it would have sent paranoia around the world in the meat market, thus driving up an incredible demand for synthetic meat. Just so happens Bill Gates is there to save the day. I'm sure Bill Gates had nothing to do with, no influence on the scientific team who said that we can no longer look at the Wuhan lab, but it might be Australian meat. Bill Gates, who just happens to be really well invested and really friendly with China and the World Health Organization. Why does Bill Gates' name come up to everything? And why does it always end up profiting Bill Gates? It's just really weird. I'm not saying, just you draw your own conclusion. I'm just showing you what's really going on here. Senior researcher, the blah, 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 a retired U.S. Army colonel. So let's read on. JBS has grown from a Brazilian cattle company to a global giant operating in over 6 countries, and that through ownership of the Swift brand became the world's largest beef processor. In the U.S., it sells beef and pork through major retailers, including Costco. The largest beef distributor in the world gets hit with ransomware right as Bill Gates's coup with vaccines is come to its fruition. The next coup just happens to send more money towards Bill Gates. This is the second major ransom attack where the government has identified the attackers are geographically based in Russia, and this is a significant political issue. It is not clear there is any Russian government support for these criminal organizations, but there is concern they are allowing them to operate fully. Yeah, neither here nor there. The power of Bill Gates' level of money knows no borders. Can be done from anywhere. The more this happens, the more they criminal hackers learn from their own successes that unfortunately has the classic dollar signs flashing in their eyes. They know they can hit where it hurts. And they did pay. May 13th. They paid the hackers. They demanded $5 million. Let's read this from the top. The group previously identified as Dark Side demanded nearly $5 million. 2 other sources familiar with the incident. The sources, CNN spoke to Thursday, They did not say how much the company paid. Bloomberg first reported the ransom payment. CISA and FBI confirmed the dark side was used as a ransomware as service in which developers of the ransomware received a share of the proceeds from the cyber criminal actors who deploy it, known as affiliates. The affiliate in this case was likely Russian, according to sources familiar with the investigation. The affiliate could be a single individual, one source said. There are also indications that the individual actors that attacked Colonial in conjunction with DarkSide may have been inexperienced or novice hackers rather than well-seasoned professionals, according to 3 sources familiar. So the dark side is the same facilitating organization for both of the hacker sites. Interesting. Among the signs that the hackers were novices, in fact, that they chose a high-risk target that deals in low-margin business, meaning the attack was unlikely to yield the kind of payout experienced ransomware actors are typically looking for, the sources say. This was a gross miscalculation on the hackers' part. I beg to differ. The goal wasn't ransomware in the first place. That's just a smokescreen. The goal is to push forward the goals of these liberal leftists. They've been pushing for the elimination of oil because of their climate change agenda, which leads them pushing towards a one world government. And their other goal, as you see here, is Bill Gates, for instance, is looking to have his synthetic meat take root. So this is about concentration of power. The goal is much bigger than this. This is not an accident or inexperienced. In fact, even an inexperienced hacker, would know to look at a high margin business that would be more quickly and willingly to send out money. They don't just, somebody doesn't just wake up one day and say, I guess I'm going to hackware the meat industry, or I'm just going to hackware that particular pipeline. They research this. Even an inexperienced amateur is going to research deeper than what they're suggesting here. No, there is a real motive for hacking those two things, and both of those two items address the issues that the leftist elite have been pushing, issues that push towards a one world government. The attack on the oil industry, the attack on beef, both related to climate change. Bill Gates himself said that cows contribute more than cars to climate change. Climate change is an issue they have to prop up. They want the issue of climate change in order to say it's an existential threat that can only be dealt with at a one world government level. It's the same story repeated over and over. Now I think I'm going to stop right here because I'll just flash through a few of these slides because there's a thing here, an article here saying Microsoft president says Orwell's 1984 could happen in 2024. We're already in the middle of Orwell's 2024, and it has nothing to do with artificial intelligence taking over like they're suggesting. It has everything to do with the elite of the world taking over, deliberate control. I can flash these up for you right now, and if later you want to read them, you go on right ahead. They're suggesting all this stuff is coming as a result of artificial intelligence. We're already in Orwell's 1984. In 2024, they were suggesting. But in any case, here we go. Well, here's an interesting one here too. $6 trillion budget to make U.S. more competitive. And what happens in this $6 trillion budget? You can read through some of this here later if you like. What was tucked in there? Jeff Bezos, $10 billion for his space company because he didn't win the contract with NASA. A $10 billion handout to Bezos, a guy whose wealth more than doubled as a result of the pandemic already. And they're taking at this time from you taxpayers $10 billion and just lobbing it over to their buddy Bezos. Everything that's been happening is for a long time now is transferring power and wealth into the hands of the already incredibly powerful and wealthy. $10 billion bailout, they're calling it. No, I think it's just every excuse they can find. They just keep handing that money up. And of course, they get a kickback on it. I'm just going to click through these, and you can read them later if you want. The articles are in the links are in the description. So 2 of the richest guys in the world are fighting over that NASA contract. Big deal. But it's still an excuse to send money. And here is that one of those scientific studies talking about the building of the your immune system and cross-reactive serums for protection from coronavirus, if you choose to read that. That's a pretty detailed scientific article. I'm not sure it's really necessary to read it, but it's there for you. So as a final thing here, Philerator, I see you now in the comments. Thank you so much for your support of Studio Burley. On a separate note, Philerator says, lots of data show the effectiveness of ivermectin as both preventative and treatment of COVID. You live where you can get it over the counter. Dosages can be found on the net. Yes, I bought ivermectin probably 3-4 months ago. What is it now, June? Yeah, at least 3 or 4 months ago. I have it here enough to treat, I think, 4 cases of coronavirus. I also have the hydroxychloroquine here too. And not that I'm suggesting you follow my prescription here, but since I had the coronavirus, I actually am taking I'm taking hydroxychloroquine 1 pill per week, on the theory that hydroxychloroquine actually takes care of any coronavirus if it gets into the cells and binds it up. And it gets hydroxychloroquine is facilitated by a vitamin D and zinc, and I take that at the same time as hydroxychloroquine. I'm using that as a prophylactic once a week, hydroxychloroquine. And I also have ivermectin in the apartment here, as I mentioned, but that's only to be used if I happen to get the symptoms. And I read also that there may be I think I dealt with this on a previous coffee break show, that there may be a synergistic effect between hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. So that, and it is known that the 2 drugs do not have any adverse interactions, so there's no problem taking them together if need be. So if I do, that will be my approach to getting the coronavirus. If I get it again, I don't think I will, but if I do get sick again, I will take the ivermectin treatment and, of course, keep taking vitamins and try to keep in generally good shape. Vitamin C is good for you. All the vitamins are good for you. So, keep yourself in good shape, keep your immune system up, and you should be fine. Not that I'm giving you that advice. It is up to each individual. I fully 100% believe this. To me, I'm not interested in the vaccine. I don't think it's good for me, so I'm not going to take it. And it'll be on a week-by-week or month-by-month basis where I have to reassess that if my life if I'm thrown into some kind of prison as a result of their laws and stuff. I'll have to reassess it possibly. But I'm going to hold out as long as possible. But I'm not telling you what you should do. My strategy is to hold out and see what happens and have these other treatments on hand should the worst happen. Try to keep healthy and so on. So with that said, that's all I've got for you today. It's been a very long show. We were just over 2 hours. There was a lot of material to cover. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm glad that quite a number of you stuck with the whole show. As I like to say at the end of these coffee sessions, do something you love to do today. Do something you love to do every day. And if you don't have something you love to do, find something and do it. This is very important. It's your life. You deserve to enjoy it. And you enjoy it by doing stuff you love to do every day, at least part of the day. So with that, I hope you can join me next time on Coffee with Steve. Until then, enjoy.